Okay, let's start off by logging into our Azure portal. If you don't have an Azure subscription, go ahead and create an account before you can begin. After logging into the Azure portal, select Create a Resource button, type Function App, and you will see the very first one that drops down. Click Create, and then fill out a name for your function. I'm going to call this Awesome Okta Functions, and leave everything the same. Go down to the bottom and click Create. So now this is going to create a new Azure function running in the .NET Core stack. And if you'll notice up here to the right-hand side, you'll see that there's a deployment in process. Once the function has been successfully deployed, you can either visit it by clicking Go to Resource, or if you pin it to the dashboard, you can click on Dashboard on the left-hand side and go into the app service that way. Once you're here, you're going to click on the Functions link with the plus sign and then click Add New Function. From here, you can either choose a template or go directly to the Quick Start, but we're going to be specifically selecting an HTTP trigger. An HTTP trigger is what will build that gateway to allow HTTP requests to wake up your function essentially and respond to it. So to do that, we're just going to go ahead and create the base one, leaving the name the same. And then if you're interested in running this, you can directly in your browser by getting the function URL here, leaving all the defaults there, copying it over, and opening it up. Great. So now it actually did end up hitting the code that was auto-generated inside of the trigger here. And this is all that is passing is a basic bad request object, because as we all know, it's important to pass in exactly what's necessary. In this case, we did not pass in a query string for name. Now that your function's been created, you might not want just anyone accessing it. Identity management can be a mess to set up, but luckily Okta makes it really painless. So let's say you would like to assign client credentials that you control to a server that calls your API, gets validated, and then delivers authenticated results from your Azure function. To do this, we're going to go ahead and create an Okta developer account and log in to the developer org URL that you get emailed once you do. Once we land inside of the dashboard, we're going to go click on Applications, Add Application, and we're going to select Service, which is machine to machine. That means this is a fully back-end, no browser involved authentication process. Click Next, and we're going to name this API Sample App. Let's say Postman is the consumer. Now that we've clicked Done, notice that there is a client ID and client secret at this point in time that you can get and give to the person or company that is consuming your Azure function that you are now turning into an HTTP triggered API. There's just one more step to do. Go up to API Authorization Servers and look at the default server that came with your free developer account. You'll notice there are a couple of other custom authorization servers in here, and that only really changes the URL that the client will have to call in order to get your token. But for this, just go directly into the default one and go to the tab that says Scopes. Now, in order for Okta to differentiate what kind of a call this is going to be, you need to create a custom one. It doesn't really matter what you name it, but this is something that you're going to need to inform your client to use when they get the token. In this case, you can just click Add Scope and call it whatever you'd like. I called mine API_scope and just hit Create, and that created this right here. Note that you don't have to make it a default scope, but you do need to make sure that the metadata publish is set to yes. Once that's all set up, then you can give your client their client ID and secret to set in the header, give them the URL that they're going to need to call to get that token, make sure they set the scope to your custom scope that you named, and lastly, set the grant type to client credentials. This ensures that there is no redirect that is done like normally would be when you sign in and allow Okta to take over that process. This means it's all done, machine to machine, backend. Now we will configure our Azure function to use Okta client credentials. To do this, go to your function in the portal, click Integrate, and then uncheck the Post option here and change the authorization level to anonymous and save it. The reason we are doing this is because Okta is a third-party identity provider, so you don't need Microsoft to do that for you. Okta will handle the token validation call from within this Azure function code. And then there are several ways that you can validate that, but we'll show you a specific one. It's using the introspection API endpoint, and that's completely done through an HTTP request. Click on the name of your trigger, and then you will be directly inside. In order to go farther, we're going to go ahead and edit this code just a little bit. Now click on the name of your HTTP trigger, and we're going to go ahead and change this a little bit. The first thing I'm going to do is remove everything but the log here and paste in what I've got. So what we're looking to do here is to pull out the header values that are passed into the request object here by setting it in here, examining if token, client ID, or client secret are missing at all, and if so, returning a bad request result. And of course, setting them to variables once we've examined that header and grabbed the first object. Great. Next, we're going to call the Okta introspection API to make sure that the token that we do receive is valid. So right underneath that, I'm going to go ahead and paste this code in here. Notice right here for the base URL, it says your Okta domain. You can find your specific one if you go back to your Okta dashboard and look up your org URL right here. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that over and replace it right here. Now we're just going to encode the request with the token, passing the access token there, passing the client ID and secret, and then I'm just newing up a new HTTP client and doing a basic post and reading the result as a string async. One last piece of code to add here. We're going to go ahead and examine the response object to see whether or not we got a successful response back from the Okta introspection API endpoint. All that's going to do is let us know whether or not that token was valid or not. And since we are handling all that inside of the function, we're going to go ahead and return an OK object result if it did go through to the client that is consuming our API, or let them know that for some reason that token did not go through. It could be that it is not theirs or that it was expired at the time. Once you've got everything in here, just click Save and make sure that everything gets completely saved with no errors. Now it's time to test out what you've created from the perspective of someone who would be consuming your Azure function as a REST API. So after you give the client their own client ID and client secret, they would use a testing tool like Postman to call Okta's token endpoint and request an access token to use for calling your API. Okta's documentation guides your client on how to make that call and quickly retrieve a usable token. So here's an example of a call to get that token using Postman. As you can see, I've just got a real basic post going on here. I'm going to go ahead and enter the URL that you would be normally giving your client to call. If I just call it like this, I get a 400 bad requests. And that is because, of course, this is a secured endpoint. So next, what we would want to do is we would want to fill out additional headers here with the client ID, client secret, and of course the token that they got from calling that endpoint. I have one prepped right here to show you. All it takes is token, client ID, and again, client secret. So that once you call it again, you get a success message, 200 OK, and of course, your little welcome message to your client. And really, that's it. Pretty fast and no IDE required. If you want to learn more about serverless.net and authentication, we've got lots of posts for you over on our developer blog. Or if you're interested in looking a little bit more at this project, I've got the entire source code on GitHub in the link below. Happy coding.